Okay, here's a question on the simple sauerkraut soup episode that we just did, and it is Caldecott. He says, I've got a challenge for James Townsend and Son and crew. So far, there have been some awesome survival foods: hardtack, ship's biscuit, sauerkraut, pemmican, or salt pork. Can these be used as the base ingredients for a survival stew to get everything the body needs on a march, or even a modern camp food? Well, really, if you go back to the, I think it was the 4th episode we did in the pemmican series, we did rubaboo. And that's exactly what rubaboo is. It's basically, hey, whatever you got, toss it in the pot. Many times I made it specifically with pemmican, but it would also work with, any kind of meat stock. They would definitely, if they were, sauerkraut kind of people, sauerkraut would go in there, potatoes, any kind of root vegetables. The ship's biscuit is a perfect thing that would go in there. Lobscouse is another one, very similar. You just kind of chuck it in there. You stew with whatever you've got. Make a perfect survival stew. And so many of the things that we've made recently and all through the cooking series would be perfect for that. The portable soup and the pemmican and the ship's biscuit. So all that kind of stuff. Hey, just chuck it in there. Make your survival stew. On the simple sauerkraut episode that we just did, Bob Spencer writes, he says, an interesting soup. Some fellow reenactors and I have been wondering if there's documentation that kraut was used by soldiers in the field and by civilians on the frontier. Do you know of any? Yes, I've got a couple of little references here. I couldn't do digging for a long time, but here are a couple of short things that we had specifically at hand. Number one, if you look at Joseph Plum Martin's memoirs, you'll find in there a section where he's on provision duty, where he's going out and getting provisions, and they're stuck in a house because it's raining really hard, and the mistress of the house feeds them a stew with a beef stew or a beef broth with sauerkraut in it. In fact, kind of very similar to what we made here. Except it had the actual meat rolling around in it. But he references kraut in his memoir. Here's another reference. This is from the writings of George Washington, from the original manuscript. This is volume 8, 1777, and he writes a letter to Philip Livingston. So George Washington is writing a letter to several people about the lack of food. And he says, if these evils can be remedied, the expense and trouble ought not to be obstacles. Though some kinds of vegetables are not to be had, others which, together with sauerkraut and vinegar, might easily be had if proper persons acquainted with the business were employed therein. So he's saying you can go and find, you might not be able to find everything that you need, but sauerkraut's one of the things you should. Later on in that book, there's a reference. On July 25th, Congress resolved that the board be employed to contract for beer, cider, vegetables, soap, vinegar, and sauerkraut, and that Washington be empowered to increase the ration of soap and some other things. So George Washington was writing about it, saying that sauerkraut should be available. Congress did work on getting committees to get sauerkraut. Now, do I have reference here that the sauerkraut actually made it into the soldiers' hands? Not in this reference work, but... So here's another reference, and this is from the Journal of Nicholas Creswell. And he says, in every street they have made ditches and barricades. Every little eminence about the town is fortified, but they basely and cowardly deserted them all as soon as ever our people got ashore. Now all these ditches and fortified places were full of stagnant water, damaged sauerkraut, and filth of every kind. So here's another reference. This is July 5th, 1777. This day arrived 3 men of war with General Clinton on board. Likewise, a fleet with provisions from Cork. I hope they have brought something better than sauerkraut. Obviously, Mr. Creswell was not a sauerkraut fan.